Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Beards and Cars. This is of course my podcast style series where we get deeper into particular subjects or countdowns, and that's more what I wanted to do with this week's topic, and this kind of ties in two particular things. One is a suggested topic from one of you guys, which was a fairly broad one and kind of one which I've modified in the case of this video because, strictly speaking, the topic was the best and worst tracks of the Gran Turismo franchise. That's an interesting topic, but the problem is, as enticing and as clickbaity as a title that could be, it's not necessarily something that I feel would be authentic to what the video I would actually make would be. Because for me, there are no, strictly speaking, bad circuits in the Gran Turismo franchise. I actually don't think there are any bad circuits really in any racing game franchise. There are just tracks that you love and tracks that you don't. That doesn't make it a bad track. Kind of like last week, of course, we were talking about the difference with opinion and fact and how the lines are blurred. Likewise with circuits. There are just some tracks that you might love, some that you're indifferent to, some that you might dislike. But that doesn't make it a bad track, because you can guarantee whatever track I mentioned, even if there was one that I could think of that I thought was specifically a bad circuit. Let's say, for instance, the Vegas drag strip. Let's say I said that that was a bad track because it was so short. You would get an influx of people saying that they love the drag strip because it's a quarter-mile way of finding out how quick your car is in a way that most other Gran Turismo games don't allow you to do. So that's the kind of thing that happens whenever you mention something that you don't like. There are tons of people who do. So having the best and worst is always a tricky situation with any subject, but when it comes to something as broad as racetracks, it just seems a little bit pointless. So instead, what I've done with that similar concept is kind of folded that in with the recent news that we had about Fuji returning to Gran Turismo in GT Sport, which I'm personally looking forward to. I would say that of the tracks that they've added so far, this is probably, at least as far as I can remember of the tracks that we've gotten, my second most anticipated. Because for me, it was Le Mans. Easily the one that I was most anticipating. That was the track that I kept on predicting over and over again that it would return. It was such an obvious choice, of course it had to. There are some other obvious ones like Spa and Laguna Seca, which you would hope that they're going to add, and personally I think that they probably will. Maybe Laguna Seca first, because it's such a huge part of the franchise, whereas Spa came a bit later, but we'll have to see. And for sure Spa has its fans, some of whom aren't going to like this video, because it's not here. Now, this particular topic is going to be kind of tying in those two things. The tracks that we like and dislike, combined with the kind of anticipation that we always get when we get news of a new circuit or a new update coming to the game. Now, of course, we could speculate, and I considered making a video speculating about what cars were going to come alongside the Fuji track, but it seemed a little bit pointless because it's such a broad thing that the vast majority of us would be wrong anyway. So you might as well just wait for the silhouettes to come out and then just cover it that way. So instead of that, what I decided to do was a countdown. A countdown of 10 tracks, in particular from the entire Gran Turismo franchise. And of course, it's a fairly obvious way to do a countdown. Your personal favourites. And for some people that might be easy, for some people that might be hard, because when you're talking about the tracks that you love, how do you really quantify if you love one more than another? With some it's obvious, but there might be some that are so close together for you. And for me that's kind of the case, because in terms of cars, tracks, motorbikes, I tend to have 5 or 10 which are set in stone, my absolute favourites. For me, like my favourite car, my favourite bike, my favourite track, they don't really change that much or if that often. But once you get down to like 8, 9 and 10, it tends for most of us to become a bit more fluid. So for me personally, this is going to be my 10 favourite circuits of the Gran Turismo franchise from Gran Turismo 1 right up until now. And of course, you can slap down below your personal choices. You could do a top 5 instead if you want to, but try not to go crazy with it. A top 10 is ideal, really. And so first of all, I'm going to kick off with a track that I might not be able to get any actual footage of. I had some footage of it with the Nike One that I planned to review, but it was in 4x3. You know the drill. It looked horrific on YouTube. I'm still trying to sort out that issue. But City Area. for me comes in at number 10. This is a track which was featured only on Gran Turismo 4 as far as the main consoles go, and it's a track which was generally classified, if I recall correctly, as more of a rally-based circuit, alongside Amalfi as well, which I really love. Amalfi's more of a happy-go-lucky kind of track, quite high speed, nice flow to it, whereas Città d'Aria, it's not very forgiving. There are a lot of very sharp turns, extremely narrow roads. Some cars just flat out don't work there at all. If you tried to take the Jay Leno tank car around there, you probably couldn't. I mean, you could, you know what I mean, but you have a ridiculously slow lap doing like a 10-point turn around some of the corners. But I love that track. The layout, the visuals, the elevation above the rest of the landscape around it, it just looks great. And the visuals of it just give me this Mille Miglia kind of vibe, like the old Mercedes SLR Sterling Moss flying around the countryside. It's got a great vibe to it. It's a great classic car track. It also has a very kind of time attack vibe to it, like a hill climb almost. It's a great all-rounder. It has some similar vibes to Goodwood, which would come later, of course, and some other tracks too kind of mixed in, but it's one of the tightest circuits in the whole franchise. If you've never driven on Città d'Aria, and you've, for instance, driven on Monaco, as an example, maybe you played Gran Turismo 6 and drove around Monaco, or Côte d'Azur as it's called, if you think that track is hard to overtake on, then you've got something else coming, because Città d'Aria makes Monaco look like a huge track in terms of road width. It's super, super close, and it actually makes it really good for rally racing, because overtaking is really difficult. I don't necessarily think that this track is going to come back anytime soon, but I would be very happy if it did. It's a really technical circuit, a very challenging one, a deceptively challenging one once you get into stuff like race cars, like prototypes or formula cars. But it's very rewarding if you get it right. If you get a flow going, you can get some pretty great laps. Moving up to number 9 for me is another track which was last seen in Gran Turismo 4, as far as I can remember, and it was available kind of as a mix of road and rally, and that is El Capitan. Now, El Capitan is a track which some people could probably just leave behind quite happily, whereas for me, it's one of those tracks, in a similar way to another one on this list, that I didn't fully appreciate when I was at the age of using it as a kid, but now that I've moved on and now that we don't have it, I find that I miss a couple of tracks in particular, and I do miss El Capitan. And the footage that you can see here of me driving the Daihatsu Midget, of course, was one of the few occasions that I had the chance to go back and do some footage on El Capitan. Because to me, El Capitan just has a really nice vibe to it. Great visuals, it's got a really good flow to it. There's no real super challenging corners, it's all about the flow. The corners are relatively high speed, and it suits pretty much any kind of car. You've got a pretty nice length home straight, some long curving bends, some deceptive rolling corners as well, especially in the hillier section. I really like it. It's a short and sweet track, but it's a lot of fun. Great high-speed flow. As I said, it's a perfect track for stuff like cup car racing or getting stuff like Caterhams around there. It's that kind of circuit. In number 8 for me, also using my own footage from Gran Turismo 3, which again is the last time that we've seen this track featured, one which I know a lot of you guys who have been around in the franchise for a long time do love as well, Special Stage Route 11. This is probably the most different of all the Special Stage tracks, because of course we have Special Stage 5, which is probably the most frequently seen in the franchise. There have been so many variations of it, so many games have featured it. Special Stage Route 7, which of course is a mix of ultra high speed with some very tight corners, and it's great for like motorway pulls, that kind of thing. It has a real life vibe to it. Then you've got Route 11, which of course is one of my favourite tracks as well. I've done the most mileage on that track of any track in the franchise because you clock up mileage so quickly. But then Route 11. This one is so different to all of the others because it doesn't have any of the high speed advantages of Route 7 or Route 10, or Route X as it's called, but it has this deceptive, challenging nature to it. Some really tight corners, a really fast home straight leading into a long sweeping right hand curve, and it's just such an interesting track. It's super enclosed in a similar way to Città d'Aria or Monaco, very challenging, very competitive, and I believe there was something like a Toyota GT1 event on it or something like that, an endurance race in Gran Turismo 3. It's just a great track. It's nighttime like most of the other special stage tracks, and it's a lot of fun. It would be the kind of track that if it were brought back, I think it would be very popular, especially for people who haven't experienced it before, because it's so different to all of the other special stage tracks, because Route 7 and Route 10 are both really easy, let's be honest. Route 5 is fairly beginner friendly. It's kind of a clubman track, and there's even a clubman version of it. Whereas this one, it's totally unforgiving. Route 11 is pure pro driver territory. Some deadpan 90-degree turns leading into immediate other 90-degree turns where you can't really get much speed up. Well, you can see in the video. For me, again, not one that I appreciated as a kid, but I definitely do now. As far as number 7, I'm putting in another one of my, of course, personal favourites, and this is one which I've always loved. Even when I was a kid, I did as well, and interestingly, it's one of the tracks which isn't just featured in Gran Turismo, but it does actually appear in Forza as well. And Forza, funnily enough, Forza 1 in particular, which of course I played for the first time last week, actually has my favourite variation of this track that I've ever seen, and that is New York. I love the New York circuit. It's an incredible track. In fact, I'll probably use the Forza 1 footage to show you what I mean, because any Gran Turismo player will recognise the track anyway. It's similar in some ways to something like a special stage Route 7, because it's got those ultra long straights. But depending on the track layout, there are some extra additional side corners which, again, like Route 7, they're very 90-degree, very technical approach, and I guess that's kind of a recurring thing to me. I really like challenging circuits, but also ones which have a pretty decent lap length, so you can get some good times, but also quite high speed on certain sections, and with New York you definitely can. Next up in 6th, I'm putting easily the track that started off the trend for me of missing tracks that I did not appreciate at all as a kid, and if I recall correctly, I think this is actually one of the circuits that I specifically did not like as a kid, but now I absolutely love it, and I love every chance I get to go back to a game that does feature it and to play on it, and that is Infineon. Now, of course, it's changed names a number of times, but I will always think of it as Infineon. There's a couple of different variations. There's the sports car course, the stock car course. The stock car's a little bit shorter. You've got an extra straight plumbed in there instead of the hairpin. I personally prefer the sports car course because it's a little bit longer, a little bit more technical. But it's an interesting looking track in terms of the layout. It's got a really nice high-speed flow, especially toward the end of the track, and it's deceptive. Again, it's a perfect track for prototype racing, especially endurance prototype racing, because it tends to be a track that, despite not being an overly long lap, you still don't get bored of it. Whereas for me, if I'm doing like 60 laps of a really short technical circuit, I get bored of it quickly. That's one of the reasons why I like long laps so much. Like Sierra, for instance, it keeps it varied. For me, though, this one, despite being relatively short, it's only a couple of minutes, if that, for a lap, it doesn't get boring because it's just non-stop. There's no real break time on Infineon. You're constantly into the next corner, which probably sounds like an obvious thing to say with any track, but with some, if you think about it, you do kind of get downtime, like a long straight where you can just turn your brain off, or some easy corners. With Infineon, it's not like that. It's corner after corner, and it's all about keeping up that flow. Next up in 5th for me is my favourite city circuit of the entire franchise. This one was an easy pick for the list. I adore this track, and I pretty much always have. Seattle. I love Seattle so much. It's an awesome city track. As I said, it's my favourite of the entire franchise. The undulating hill sections, the constant 90-degree, if not close to 90-degree turns, some great high-speed sections, and it's just a track which can appeal to literally any level of car. You can see me here probably driving the Ford Model T. That's, I think, the footage that I'll use, but you can drive anything from super slow vintage or classic cars like this one, right up until Formula cars or prototypes. And of course, with a city circuit, the faster the vehicle you use, the more challenging it becomes. And I spent so much time on Seattle that back in the day, I think I even put the video on YouTube, I used to drive the Chaparral 2J around certain tracks in reverse, way back on Gran Turismo 4, before people started doing that on Gran Turismo 6. And I used to drive around these circuits all the way in reverse, and I went around New York in reverse, I went around Seattle in reverse, and I could do faster laps in reverse in the Chaparral than I could driving a TVR Speed 6 forward. So I love these tracks. I spent so much time on them. I still love to feature them in reviews, like from Gran Turismo 2 or newer games when it gives me the opportunity. But yeah, I just think Seattle's such a charming track. I like the lighting, the tone, the time of day, everything about it just appeals to me. Next up, moving into the fourth position now, probably the most controversial, I would say, of the list, because most, if not all of the other tracks are pretty much universally loved, and if you don't love it, you're probably familiar with it or have driven on it if you've been around in the franchise. This one, though, is one of the few tracks that even people who have driven on it sometimes don't like, or at least are not a fan of at all, whereas for me, it's a track that I love more for what it can do than the track itself. Because, in effect, it's the ultimate test course. Because, of course, we had the test course Speedway in Gran Turismo's past, which was a great little track, but the lap was so short, the straights were non-existent in a fast car. You pull a wheelie tune in a Toyota GT1 and it takes about 6 seconds to do the straight. So it's not that long a track. It's fun, but only to a certain level. Route X is the answer to that. Route X is like the test course times 10. It's a massive circuit. It's not quite the biggest in the game, Sierra is, but it's very close. It takes you around 4 minutes for a lap or quicker in certain cars like Juarez or Veyrons, and it's so much fun. And as I mentioned earlier, one track in particular is the one that I've done the most mileage on, and that's this one. I don't recall exactly how much mileage I've done because I actually lost my Gran Turismo 6 game save. Some of you guys will remember that. You were around for long enough on the channel. When my PS3 broke, I had to get a new one, start all over again. So between the two game saves of Gran Turismo 6 alone, without even including Gran Turismo 5, because believe it or not, I never drove on this track on GT5 because I bought it after the servers went down, and so I couldn't get the DLC, which really annoyed me. But on GT6 alone, I believe I've done in excess of 150,000 miles on Route X alone, between two game saves. Which sounds insane, because it kind of is, but of course, this track literally has been the most important track of this channel, because it's how it got started. Way back from late 2013, especially through 2014, we didn't even start doing reviews on this channel until early 2015, so for over a year, Route X was the bread and butter of this channel. Every single day I would put out tune setups. There are over 700 of them on this channel for Gran Turismo, pretty much Gran Turismo 6 alone. So going through that many cars, doing that much mileage, this track, in terms of my love for it, actually is very similar to Gran Turismo 6 as a whole. The reason why I have such a huge amount of love and respect for the game is more so than just enjoying it, it's what it's done for me. It made this channel what it is. It got me started. So it just has this integral importance to me, as Gran Turismo Sport will for some people. But for me, it was GT6, and in particular this track, that was so instrumental to founding this channel and becoming well known for the two things that I am known for, tunes and reviews. And the tunes are completely thanks to this track. And of course, although you have the people on the opposite side who think that it's an absolutely boring track, which I can understand, I actually find Route X much more interesting than the test course was, because the test course was just long enough to go fast, but not quite long enough to go fast enough, so you'd constantly be chasing your own tail, whereas Route X, you can actually prove what a car can do. And if you think that it's a boring track, you should have been there in early 2014 when there were hundreds of lobbies with hundreds of people racing around this track, when, of course, I did the first tune setup I'd ever done on the channel, a reverse speed tune for the Chaparral 2J. Before anyone else was doing it, I started that. I started that trend, I was using it online, people started noticing me winning races backwards, and then it caught on. It started becoming the thing to do. But even without crazy stuff like that, it's such a competitive field of racing, kind of like NASCAR in terms of how competitive it is, but with much more interesting vehicles, I would say, because you have such amazing rivalries between Esprits, Vipers, Cadillac Cians, TVR Speed 12s, Veyrons, Pagani Huayras, Zondas. It's such an amazing mix of vehicles, with the occasional prototype or that one kid who would always try to run a Tomahawk or a Red Bull. Good times. Good times on a great track, as far as I'm concerned. But moving up into my top three now, my third place pick might surprise some people, but This one, alongside Seattle, for me, is my other favourite from the past of the franchise. It's only ever been featured in one Gran Turismo game, and that is the incredible complex string. And I know a ton of you guys just went, yes, because you love it as well. This track is severely underloved, and it's the kind of track that as soon as you get a circuit editor, as we did in Gran Turismo 6, everyone tries to make this track, including myself. I did a video on that. And although other people made more accurate ones after I did, there was no doubt in my mind that that was going to be the first thing that I would make. Complex String is a difficult track to explain why we love it so much. You kind of have to experience it. It's essentially the ultimate test course, but not just for speed. It's like the special stage Route X of technical circuits, just the ultimate version. It's got every kind of corner you can imagine, from hairpins to square corners to rolling slalom type corners which get bigger and bigger in terms of their scope, which are deceptive and throw you off the track. It's almost like a Hot Wheels track, but a realistic version of what that would look like. It's a great circuit. Again, you can see my footage here from Gran Turismo 3. It's a relatively visually bland track. It's very flat, not much scenery, but if they brought it back, they could easily update stuff like that. It's a long track as well. If I recall, it takes around like 4 to 5 minutes, something like that, to do a lap in a road car. So it's a decent length as well. And it's the kind of track that I've always loved because the biggest strength of my driving style is endurance. Even as a kid, it always was, because I could race against people who would start to make mistakes. And on a long track, you can't afford to do that. Whereas for me, although I'm not the quickest of drivers, I'm more consistent than fast. So although some guy might beat me in terms of his lap, he'll start to make mistakes after lap 10, 12, 18, 20, whereas I won't. I'll still be keeping those consistent average times and start catching up. And I've won a lot of races that way, against the AI and against real people. And that's why I love long tracks, because it's not about how fast you are through each corner, it's about how consistent you are over the course of the whole track. Sierra, again, perfect example of that. Now, perhaps surprisingly, Sierra is not on my top 10 list, because although I do like it, for me, the track is inherently flawed by how bad it looks. It's such a horrendous looking track, and for Gran Turismo 6, it's just not acceptable. The scenery, the graphics, it just looks absolutely horrific, especially once you've played Gran Turismo Sport and go back to it. The track itself is gorgeous, perfect for cruising. There are even parking spaces on the track for that, and it's fantastic. I love it. But not quite enough to actually be on the list for me. If they redid it, I would be more than happy to have it back, though. For me, in second place, probably what many people would have as their number one, and both my second and first place picks are both real tracks. Second place for me, the Nürburgring. What a track. What a legendary circuit. And of course, tons of people will have it as their number one because it's just that kind of track. In a similar way to Complex String, it's like the ultimate proving ground. And it delivers exactly what I like. As I said just now, it's about consistency. You don't need to be the fastest guy through every single corner to have a good race. It's about knowing enough about each corner to still win and to edge ahead of the competition, and that's when my strength comes in. I'm not the quickest of drivers through any particular corner, but I'm fast over the course of the whole thing, as many of you guys are as well, and that's what makes it so fun. And the Nürburgring, it's one of those tracks where your flow is so important, just like Infineon, but on a much larger scale. So for me, it's been such a huge part of my racing experience. As far back as whatever it was, 2004, when Gran Turismo 4 came out, I was first introduced to this track, fell in love with it immediately, and I've done so many miles on the Nürburgring that it's probably my second highest mileage track to Route X, maybe even higher over the course of all of the games. I wouldn't be surprised actually if it was. It's a great track, and in particular the Nordschleife is my favourite. I know the 24-hour circuit is the ultimate version, but to me I have more of an idea of a good lap from the Nordschleife than I do for the 24-hour. The 24-hour, it gets a bit hazy for me in terms of how the lap times compare, but with the Nordschleife, it's easy to remember, 5-minute laps, 6 minutes, 7 minutes, what you'd expect a certain car to be capable of, and I just like the flow. I've never liked the GP course anyway, so adding that to the track doesn't do anything for me. So the Nordschleife in particular, gorgeous track. Perfect circuit, I would say. But of course, in number one, what else is it going to be? The track that I talked about already in the video but hasn't been featured. Le Mans. my favourite racetrack of all time, let alone in a game, in the real world as well, because to me, it's the perfect combination of everything that I love. It's a long lap, it's got a huge straight, just like Route X, it's technical and challenging, like Complex String, and it's real, like the Nordschleife. It's got everything I love about tracks. It looks fantastic, and it has such an incredibly rich history, again, just like the Nürburgring has. But to me, I think that the edge that I would give Le Mans is not only does it have, for me, my favourite form of racing ever done, which is the 24-hour race, but it's also a quicker lap than the Nordschleife. And although I said I love long tracks, I like tracks that kind of form the balance between the two, because with the Nürburgring, you're looking at more like 5, 6, 7 minute laps, depending on the car, whereas with the Le Mans, it's a quicker lap. You're looking at 3, 4 minutes. It's still a long track, but because it's so high speed, you can actually get it done quite quickly. So it has this balance between being a genuinely long circuit, it's around 8.5 miles, but it doesn't feel that long. But it's just as challenging for people who think they're a great driver, but have never driven on it before. It looks like an easy track, but there are some deceptive corners in there, and once again, it's all about that flow. For me, I love Le Mans. And it also doubles up as being pretty much the perfect track for everything you want to do. You can take formula cars there, you can take prototypes, you can take supercars, you can even have fun with some classics going super slow down the straight. So yeah, I love Le Mans, it's easily my favourite track. The Nordschleife is a close second, but second nonetheless. Overall, that's it for my top 10, and of course, as I said, I'd love to hear yours down below as well, and I should think that probably a number of these will be featured. There are some which some people might have expected me to say, like Laguna Seca or Spa. I know many of you will include Spa, but for me, I like those tracks, but I don't love them like I do these. And of course, keep it to tracks that are actually in the franchise, so you know, I love Imola as much as the next guy, but it isn't in the franchise, so keep it to Gran Turismo tracks only. But that's it for this pick. Of course, I'll see you guys next week as usual, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.